Here are my thoughts on the readings for Unit 2, the book on making smart decisions, pages 75 to 93. I thought it was interesting that this chapter started out with saying that most leaders get decision-making all wrong. This is mostly because decisions are typically considered as an event at one point in time without considering all of the external factors affecting the decision, and thinking both short-term and long-term, proximally and distally. Decision-making is not an event, but rather it's a process. Once again, I really appreciate how this chapter is based on research rather than opinion. Remember, you want to make evidence-based decisions wherever possible. Don't forget about the Latham book that I mentioned on my previous week's post. This chapter highlights research by two decision-making scholars who show that the difference between leaders who make bad versus good decisions is usually because some leaders consider decisions to be events, while others consider them to be processes. I wanted to highlight the two types of decision-making processes, inquiry and advocacy. Inquiry, as your book suggests, is the open process designed to generate multiple alternatives, foster the exchange of ideas, and produce a well-tested solution. But this doesn't come easy to most people, and so we tend to default to the other process called advocacy, where decision-making is much more like a contest. Both approaches look similar, but the outcome is very different. When we're using the advocacy approach, we tend to downplay the negatives of our position in the interest of winning the debate. You can see how the inquiry approach would be much more productive. We consider a variety of options, we work with others to discover solutions, and stimulate creative thinking rather than suppressing dissension. I think the approach in your book to remember the importance of being aware of using the inquiry versus advocacy approach is really useful. The 3 C's that are highlighted in the shaded box on pages 78 to 79. Definitely something for your checklist or questions that you can ask yourself as you begin to engage in your decision-making process. Reading through these recommendations highlighted something for me. These seem like common sense, and yet they are so hard to keep in mind and implement. Why is that? Because we have a tendency to have bias in our decision-making, and we tend to make decisions in a non-rational way, even though we know we should be making rational decisions. Could it be in part because of misleading prejudgments and or misleading experiences? Could it be because of emotional tagging? How would these affect our ability to implement an inquiry versus advocacy approach to decision-making? It's all starting to fit together. Let's take a closer look at the 3 C's and how they are relevant. Constructive conflict. Conflict, like many other concepts in leadership, has what I call an inverted U relationship. You have a picture in front of you with a graph. It's an upside-down U, with a bottom axis having conflict on it, and the y-axis measures performance or the quality of decisions. While it's not a traditional view of conflict, what this inverted U tells you is that we do need some conflict in an organization in order to maximize our performance or decision-making quality. We need to ask questions about what's being done, why it's being done, and how it's being done. As long as this is a task or process type conflict, could also be called cognitive, and not personal or affective conflict directed towards an individual, conflict can be positive up to a certain point, the top of the inverted U. Once conflict reaches that point on the graph where performance starts to fall, so the downside or the right side of the inverted U, then performance or decision-making quality starts to decline. When you see the graph in front of you, it makes a lot more sense. What I'm trying to say is that conflict can be a good thing, the right kind of conflict up to a point. But too much conflict causes performance and decision-making quality to decrease. The challenge for leaders is to know how much conflict is the right amount in the decision-making process, and the challenge to increase cognitive conflict while reducing affective conflict. Certainly not an easy task. I wonder what organizational policies we could put into place to help us to stimulate the right amount of conflict and the right type of conflict. Again, it's all starting to come together. There are some great recommendations on page 84 for individuals to implement as leaders to steer towards cognitive and away from affective conflict. I couldn't have been more thrilled to see the term procedural fairness in this reading. Hopefully you remember the term from my approach to pedagogy and the article I wrote on motivating students. Procedural fairness or justice is not a concept to be forgotten. It's so incredibly important for a leader in so many different contexts. The second C, consideration, making sure that all options are considered and that the decision-making process is not only fair, but more importantly, that the process is perceived as fair. The concept of voice says that as long as our employees have a voice, the opportunity to participate in the process, they will be more accepting of the decision even if they are not happy with the outcome. It's not, however, just about having that voice and being heard. It's about the person perceiving that they have been understood and that their point was taken into consideration. Voice without consideration is often damaging and leads to resentment and frustration rather than acceptance, as your text says. Think about this course. If I ask, which I will ask at the end of week 3, for a stop, start, continue, I will ask for your feedback and give you a voice to make changes to the course. If I were to take that feedback and then not do anything with it, you wouldn't be motivated. However, if I take the feedback, summarize it, present the results back to you, and then tell you as a group things I can change and can't change, you will be more motivated. That's procedural fairness. It's very important that employees, students, have opportunities in the decision-making process to contribute, understand the process, and then feel like the changes that were implemented were fair. Implementing procedural fairness is absolutely critical in being an effective leader. I would actually add a fourth C, communication, because it's not just about being procedurally fair, but communicating about the process so that the process is perceived as being fair. Their third C, so the book's third C, is closure. Deciding to end the consideration either too early or too late is damaging, but choosing the right time is difficult. The authors highlight the concept of groupthink, something I don't want to just gloss over because it occurs far too often, and we'll learn about it later on in the course. But it's basically when a group is so cohesive that it values group consensus over decision quality. Everyone wants to keep the group cohesive, so they sacrifice decision quality so they don't rock the boat or do anything to upset the group. Like I said, we'll come back to this later on in the course. I'll finish this summary by looking at chapter 4 in the Think Again book. Whereas the previous reading focused on biases that can occur in group decision making, this chapter focuses on biases that can occur at the individual level. For example, recognizing that different individuals are predisposed to approach decisions differently than others. Some are more analytical, while some are not. What these two readings do have in common is that individuals tend to see decision-making as a discrete event rather than a process, hence the one plan at a time diagram on page 62. Prime decision makers more often than not tend to make judgments about the right course of action without carefully considering all of the options, again, acting in a non-rational way. This chapter really builds on the concepts from the previous chapter, misleading experiences and prejudgments, by suggesting that decision-making is primed by our subconscious recognition mechanisms and that these influence the decision-making process. What's new in this chapter is the notion that our brains only assess one option at a time. We do not naturally lay out alternatives and evaluate our options. The takeaways from this reading are really the recommendations on page 66 to 70, although I'm not really sure if they add too much more to the reading that was summarized above. Again, another expert's take on the same idea, that both individual, personality, misleading prejudgments and experiences, inappropriate self-interest and self-attachment factors, think also about group factors like groupthink, for example, and organizational policies, all of these things play a role in a leader's ability to make effective decisions. And that's a really important learning from this unit, that the decision needs to be seen as a process with all of these factors taken into consideration and not a discrete event.